If your refrigerator has a bag of lettuce in it right now, or you picked up cilantro, basil, or berries at the store this week, I want you to keep listening for the next few minutes, because what I'm about to walk you through could change how you think about something as simple as a salad. I'm Dr. Robert Vance, and before we go any further, I want to tell you exactly what's happening, what we actually know, what we don't know yet, and what that means for you personally. Not for everyone over 60 as some abstract group. For you, here's the situation in plain terms. Health officials in the United States are currently tracking a multi-state outbreak of a foodborne parasite called Cyclosporiasis. It causes an illness called Cyclosporiasis. Case counts have climbed well above what's typical for this time of year, with clusters reported in several states, and investigators have been working to trace the source. As of mid-July, traceback and epidemiologic data pointed to iceberg lettuce from a specific supplier, and a recall was issued for that product. I'll walk you through the specifics later because I think the details actually matter more than the headline. But I want to be upfront about something right at the start. This outbreak has historically and in past seasons also been associated with other fresh items like cilantro, basil, and berries. That does not mean every bag of spinach or box of raspberries in your kitchen right now is part of this particular outbreak. It means Cyclospora, as a parasite, tends to travel on certain kinds of produce, and it's worth understanding why, so you can make sensible decisions instead of either ignoring this completely or throwing out your entire refrigerator in a panic. I've been practicing medicine for a long time, and if there's one thing I've learned about health headlines, it's this. They rarely tell you what you actually need to know to make a decision. They tell you enough to worry you, and then they move on to the next story. I don't work that way. My job in this video is to give you the same explanation I would give a patient sitting across from me in my office. Calm, specific, and honest about the parts we don't have full answers to yet. So let's start with why this particular illness deserves your attention if you're over 60, because the reason isn't what most people assume. It's not that Cyclospora specifically hunts down older adults. It doesn't. Anyone who eats contaminated produce at any age can become infected. What changes with age is not your likelihood of exposure. What can change is how your body handles the illness once it's there, and more importantly, how easily the illness gets misread or dismissed before it's properly addressed. That distinction matters, and I'll come back to it because I think it's the part most people miss entirely. Let me explain what this parasite actually is in language that doesn't require a microbiology degree. Cyclosporiasis is a single-celled parasite, far too small to see with the naked eye. It doesn't behave like a bacteria or a virus. It has a specific life cycle that requires it to pass through soil or water before it becomes capable of infecting a person. That's actually an important detail because it means the parasite typically isn't spread directly from one sick person to another the way a stomach flu is. You generally can't catch it just from being around someone who has it. You get it by consuming something, usually fresh produce or contaminated water, that came into contact with feces containing the parasite at some point earlier in the growing, harvesting, or handling process. That's uncomfortable to hear, I know. Nobody wants to think about how their salad got to their plate. But understanding it actually helps you understand why fresh, raw produce, specifically things you don't cook, are the foods most associated with this kind of outbreak. Leafy greens, herbs like cilantro and basil, and berries have thin surfaces. They're often eaten raw, and they can be difficult to clean thoroughly if the contamination happened early in the growing process, sometimes from irrigation water. That's not a flaw specific to any one farm or brand. It's a known vulnerability of fresh produce in general, and it's exactly why outbreaks like this one tend to happen every few years, usually during the warmer months. Now here's where I want to slow down and be precise, because this is where a lot of health content, frankly, gets sloppy. The current outbreak has been specifically linked through traceback and epidemiologic investigation to iceberg lettuce from a supplier that sources from central Mexico. A recall was issued in mid-July for that lettuce, including certain packaged products sold under a retail brand. If you want the exact recall details, I'd encourage you to check the CDC and FDA outbreak pages directly because recall information updates, and I don't want to give you information here that could be outdated by the time you're watching this. What I can tell you with confidence is this. The confirmed source based on the evidence available so far is that specific lettuce supply chain. Cilantro, basil, and berries are foods that have been linked to Cyclospora outbreaks in previous years, and they remain foods worth handling carefully But as of the most recent investigation updates, they have not been confirmed as the source of this particular outbreak. I'm telling you that distinction on purpose because I don't want you finishing this video thinking your strawberries are contaminated when the evidence doesn't support that. This is honestly one of the hardest parts of covering an outbreak like this responsibly. Investigators often know a category of risk before they know the specific product. And by the time a specific source is confirmed and a recall goes out, a lot of the contaminated product has often already been eaten because these illnesses can take days to show up, get diagnosed, and get reported. The investigation itself is racing against a delay that's built into how these illnesses work. So officials are quite reasonably telling people to be cautious with the type of produce that's historically been associated with this parasite while they work to nail down exactly what's driving this season's case count. That's not indecisiveness on their part. That's how outbreak investigations actually function. Let's talk about what happens after someone actually consumes contaminated food, because this is where the illness becomes genuinely tricky to identify, and it's a detail I think deserves more attention than it usually gets. Symptoms of Cyclosporiasis typically don't appear right away. There's usually a delay of about a week after exposure before symptoms start, sometimes longer. Think about that for a second. That means if you feel unwell on a Thursday, the food most likely responsible isn't necessarily anything you ate that day or even that week. It could be something from several days or even a week and a half earlier. Most people don't connect symptoms to a meal that far back. They think about what they ate yesterday or the day before. That gap is exactly why so many cases of Cyclosporiasis get misattributed to something I ate last night, when the actual culprit was consumed well before that. The symptoms themselves, when they appear, commonly include watery diarrhea, which can be frequent and in some cases quite severe, along with cramping, bloating, nausea, loss of appetite, fatigue, and sometimes a low-grade fever. Some people also lose weight without trying, simply because they're not eating much and their body is working overtime. Here's the detail that I think genuinely surprises people. Cyclosporiasis has a pattern of coming and going. Symptoms can improve for a few days and then return. That relapsing pattern is actually somewhat distinctive, and it's one of the clues that leads a physician to consider Cyclospora specifically, rather than assuming it's a typical short-lived stomach bug that clears up on its own within a day or two. I want to be very clear about something here, because I don't want this video to turn into a list of symptoms that makes you assume every stomach issue you've had recently is this parasite. Diarrhea, fatigue, and nausea are unfortunately some of the most common and non-specific symptoms in all of medicine. They can be caused by dozens of things. A different, more common stomach virus, something you ate that simply didn't agree with you, a medication side effect, stress, another infection entirely. The vast majority of people who have a few days of stomach upset this summer do not have cyclosporiasis. I say that not to dismiss your symptoms if you have them, but because I think it's important that you don't spend the rest of the season assuming the worst every time your stomach is unsettled. What matters is the pattern, diarrhea that lasts more than a few days, especially if it improves and then comes back, combined with fatigue that doesn't make sense for how little you've actually been doing, is the combination that deserves a conversation with your doctor. A single day of loose stool after a big meal out is not that. Now let's talk about why age and overall health status changed the picture here, because this is the part of the video that's actually specific to why I titled this the way I did. If you're generally healthy, well hydrated, and not managing multiple chronic conditions, cyclosporiasis is unpleasant, but it's rarely dangerous in itself. Most people recover, sometimes with treatment, sometimes with supportive care and time. What changes the equation for some older adults isn't the parasite becoming more aggressive. It's what prolonged diarrhea can do to a body that's already managing other things. Extended fluid loss can lead to dehydration more quickly in someone who has reduced kidney function, someone on certain blood pressure medications or diuretics, someone managing diabetes, or someone whose thirst signals aren't as reliable as they used to be, which is actually a normal part of aging for many people and not something to be embarrassed about. Dehydration in that context can affect blood pressure, kidney function, and how well other medications are absorbed or metabolized. That's the real mechanism of concern here. It's not that the parasite behaves differently in someone who is 65 versus someone who is 35. It's that the consequences of several days of fluid loss can compound faster when there's already less physiological reserve to draw from. I want to say this plainly because I think it needs to be said plainly. This does not mean every person over 60 is automatically high risk. Risk here depends on your actual health picture. Someone who is 68, active, well hydrated, and not managing significant chronic illness is in a very different position than someone who is 78, managing kidney disease and taking multiple medications that affect fluid balance. I'm not saying this to create two categories where one group should worry and one shouldn't. I'm saying it because I think you deserve to think about your own actual health status rather than a number when you're deciding how seriously to take a few days of symptoms. Let me give you an example to make this more concrete. I want to be upfront that this is a hypothetical scenario, not a real patient, but it reflects a pattern I've seen described many times in cases like this. Imagine a woman in her late 60s. She's active, she gardens, she eats well, she takes a blood pressure medication, and that's about it. She picks up a pre-made salad kit from the grocery store one week, has it a couple of times over a few days, nothing unusual. About a week and a half later, she starts having loose, watery stools. She assumes it's something she ate the night before, maybe a restaurant meal, and doesn't think much of it. It's uncomfortable, but not alarming. A couple of days later, it seems to be improving. Then, a few days after that, it comes right back, this time along with real fatigue, the kind where she doesn't feel like getting up to do her usual morning walk. She's drinking water, but not really tracking how much. By the time nearly 2 weeks have passed since it started, with 2 rounds of symptoms and increasing tiredness, she finally calls her doctor, mostly because her daughter insisted, after hearing how she sounded on the phone, that relapsing pattern, combined with the duration, is exactly the kind of presentation that leads a physician to specifically test for Cyclospora, using a stool test that looks for that parasite in particular, because a standard general stool exam doesn't always catch it. That scenario isn't meant to frighten you. It's meant to show you what the pattern actually looks like in real life, because it rarely looks dramatic. It looks like something easy to brush off, right up until it's gone on longer than it should have. So let's talk about when you should actually pick up the phone and call your doctor, because I think this is more useful to you than a list of symptoms alone. Contact your doctor if diarrhea lasts more than a few days, particularly if it's watery and frequent. Contact your doctor sooner rather than waiting if you notice it improving and then returning, since that relapsing pattern is worth mentioning specifically, because it will help guide what testing makes sense. And there are situations that call for more prompt attention, not panic, but promptness. Signs of significant dehydration, things like a very dry mouth, dizziness or lightheadedness when you stand up, a noticeable drop in how much you're urinating, confusion, or a rapid heartbeat, deserve same-day medical attention rather than a wait-and-see approach. If you're managing kidney disease, heart failure, diabetes, or you're on medications like diuretics or certain blood pressure drugs, I'd encourage you to have a lower threshold for calling, simply because fluid balance matters more in those situations, and it's easier to correct early than after several days of losses. If your doctor does suspect cyclosporiasis, the relevant test is a stool sample specifically evaluated for Cyclospora. It's worth mentioning to your doctor if you're aware of the current outbreak and if you've recently eaten fresh produce like lettuce, herbs, or berries, because that context genuinely helps guide testing, since a standard stool culture doesn't automatically screen for this particular parasite. There is treatment available for confirmed cyclosporiasis, typically an antibiotic combination, and most people recover well with appropriate treatment and supportive care, including adequate fluids. I'm not going to give you a specific treatment protocol here, because that decision belongs between you and your physician, and it can depend on other medications you're taking and your overall health picture. Now, let's talk about what you can actually do practically starting today, because I think this is where most videos on this topic either get too vague or too extreme. Washing fresh produce under running water is worthwhile and something you should be doing regardless of any outbreak, but I want to be honest with you about its limits here. Cyclospora has a tough outer shell, and washing alone doesn't reliably remove it the way it removes surface dirt or some bacteria. That's not me telling you washing is pointless. It's me telling you washing shouldn't be treated as a guarantee. Cooking, on the other hand, is genuinely effective. Heating produce to a proper cooking temperature kills the parasite. That's why, during a period like this, a reasonable, moderate approach for high-risk raw items, particularly the ones directly connected to the current investigation or historically associated with these outbreaks, is to consider cooking them rather than eating them raw for the time being, if that's practical for you and the food in question. I recognize you can't really cook a salad and have it remain a salad, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. This is where personal risk tolerance and your own health situation come into the decision. Freezing, for what it's worth, is not a reliable way to eliminate this particular parasite the way it can be for some others. So freezing your greens isn't a workaround here. The most direct thing you can do is stay informed about the actual recall. If a specific product from a specific supplier has been recalled, and you have that product at home, don't eat it and follow the disposal or return guidance in the recall notice. That's a very different action than avoiding an entire category of food indefinitely. If you bought a bag of iceberg lettuce recently, it's worth checking whether it matches the recalled product specifically, rather than assuming all lettuce everywhere is affected. For produce that hasn't been specifically recalled but falls into the broader category historically associated with these outbreaks, like cilantro, basil, and berries, a reasonable middle ground is thorough washing, being mindful of where and how you're buying it, and simply paying attention to how your body feels over the next week or two after eating it, particularly if you're in a higher risk health category. I also want to address something directly because I think it's important. If you've already eaten something you're now wondering about, please don't spend the next 2 weeks anxious about it. The overwhelming majority of people who eat produce during a period like this do not become ill. If you do develop symptoms, you now know what pattern to watch for, and you know when it's worth calling your doctor. That's genuinely the most useful thing you can do with this information. Worrying in advance about food you've already eaten doesn't change anything, and I'd rather you spend that energy paying attention to how you actually feel over the coming days. Let's also talk about what this outbreak does not mean, because I think this matters just as much as what it does mean. It does not mean fresh produce as a category is dangerous. Fruits and vegetables remain an important part of a healthy diet, and the overall risk of foodborne illness from produce, even during an active outbreak, remains relatively low for any individual purchase. It does not mean every symptom of an upset stomach this summer is this parasite. It does not mean you need to stop eating salads, herbs, or berries indefinitely, and it does not mean that everyone over 60 is walking around at significant risk. What it means is that there's an active confirmed outbreak connected to a specific product, additional foods worth handling thoughtfully based on historical patterns, and a set of symptoms worth recognizing so that if they happen to you, you don't dismiss them for 2 weeks the way it's easy to do. I also want to be honest about what remains unknown, because a responsible explanation includes that. Investigators may identify additional sources connected to this outbreak as their work continues. Case counts in the states involved can change as more data comes in. It's also worth knowing that testing and reporting for this parasite isn't perfectly consistent everywhere, which means the numbers you see reported are very likely an undercount of the true number of cases, since many people recover without ever seeking care or being tested. I'd rather tell you plainly that the picture is still developing than pretend there's a complete tidy answer right now, because there isn't. If you take one thing away from everything I've walked you through, I'd want it to be this. You don't need to be afraid of your refrigerator. You need to know what's actually been recalled. You need to recognize a pattern of symptoms that's worth mentioning to a doctor rather than waiting out. And you need to pay a little more attention to hydration if you're managing other health conditions, especially over the next several weeks while this outbreak season plays out. That's a very different mental posture than fear. It's just attentiveness, the kind I think most of us develop naturally as we get a little older and learn which health signals are worth paying attention to and which ones aren't. If you found this kind of explanation useful, the way I approach every topic on this channel is the same. I tell you what's confirmed, I tell you what's still being figured out, and I tell you what you can actually do about it without exaggerating the danger or brushing past something that genuinely deserves your attention. If that's the kind of health information you're looking for, consider subscribing, because that's what you'll find here every time. I've been doing this long enough to know that not every health headline deserves the alarm it gets. But I've also learned that a few symptoms quietly ignored for too long are how a manageable problem becomes a harder one. You don't need to panic about what's in your kitchen right now. You do need to pay attention if something doesn't resolve the way it should, and you do need to reach out to your doctor if it doesn't. That's not fear. That's just good judgment, and I trust you to use it. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you in the next one.